All praise to the Omnissiah and much excited beeping noises because the Adeptus Mechanicus look like they're getting a massive buff in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about Admech in the Arks of Omen season, an army that seems to have been massively improved by these updates, getting big lifts in terms of rules, points and secondary objectives. It's really quite a good thing for them, I think. After their brief heyday where they stomped the meta flat for a bit, Games Workshop gave them some rather hefty points nerfs, and the rest of the codexes that came out tended to be far stronger than they were. In Nephilim, it meant that they were basically one of the worst armies in the game, with the lowest win rate out of just about any of them, bar some Space Marine chapters, but I have a feeling that that trend is going to be fairly heavily reversed with all these big buffs. Let's talk through the balanced Dataslate changes in a bit more detail, then the changes to 40k in general that have helped them, then go through each of their points changes one by one, talk through their secondaries, and how all these changes might impact lists overall. So first up, perhaps one of the biggest and most exciting changes they got were Kataphrons servitors gaining the core keyword. This one's really quite a big deal, as loads of buffs in the Adeptus Mechanicus army are core locked. Previously they were very rarely taken compared with their Skitarii counterparts, but now I feel like they're going to be very much in contention once more. Big chunky 3 wound units with heavy weapons and getting big buffs is perhaps a recipe for some good times on the gunnery command front. Going through a few of their more obvious buffs that you could put on them, there's a fair few Holy Order traits that now apply to them that no longer did. The Magi one for exploding 6s on the advanced part is quite nice, very good when you're hitting on 4s anyway. The Logi initial part could be good for making them durable, that gets to ignore AP-1 and AP-2 on a unit, quite commonly used on big bricks of Skitarii, but it works fine here. The Artisan's advanced one can give them +1 strength, really quite nice for things like the heavy arc rifles going up to strength 7, and the raiment of the Technomartyr is quite a popular relic. That one can allow a unit to ignore modifiers, maybe pretty handy for Skitarii rangers in general, but if you happen to be taking any -1 to hit penalties with the Kataphrons, that's quite a big deal as they hit on 4s. Perhaps the single easiest buffs to put on them though are just some character buffs. You could have them sitting next to a Tech Priest Dominus and getting some reroll 1s to hit now. That's particularly powerful for the Kataphron destroyers with the Plasma Culverins, as they overheat a bit if you overcharge them too hard. Belisarius' core went down a bit, and he can give a unit 4 rerolls if he wants to. I'm still not 100% certain that that's going to be more powerful than doing similar to a big unit of Iron Striders or something, but at least on paper with some Plasma Kataphrons it does seem fairly scary. Core could also keep a unit, say in Shroud Psalm all game long for some tough breaches perhaps, and the Tech Priest Manipulus is actually more useful on them now. He can make their arc weapons +6-inch range and AP-1 better, quite nice for the breaches. AP-3 on those heavy arc rifles would be nice. Beyond that, the breaches can now use the Fight's Last stratagem, really not bad seeing as they're quite combat capable with those hydraulic claws. Again, that was core or character locked. There's a whole bunch of Forge World specific warlord traits and relics that now apply. Lucy is perhaps particularly interesting for their teleportation relic and luminescent blessing for transhuman, though again those buffs might well still be best applied to Skitarii troops. It is quite good for getting Vanguard where they need to be. Even on top of that though, they also gained the 5+ invul save from the new improved bionics. Plasma Culverins went down to 45 points rather than 50 on the destroyers, and strategic reserves are potentially pretty useful for them as well, getting line of sight with those heavy weapons that are quite slow. Overall, I'm a little bit uncertain as to just how people are going to make use of all of this stuff. The Admech army is one with a whole ton of stacking buffs and things. I don't know which ones people are going to typically want to build around more than others. I feel like on paper, still the breaches might be the better way to go, having a bit of firepower and a bit of combat. Fight's Last is a really nice advantage for them, and then maybe back them up with some rerolls from a Dominus perhaps. You could have him affecting quite a lot of units there. Building around gun line destroyers does seem a lot more doable now. I feel like they will actually have some competition with the Iron Striders, which they really didn't before. Moving on, basically the entire codex that has bionics now is upgraded to the Masterwork ones with the 5+ invuls. The beneficiaries of that are the Kataphron servitors, Skitarii troops, the Iron Strider Ballistari and the Sindonian Dragoons, and the regular bog standard servitors. Gaining a 5+ invul save is certainly no bad thing with the amount of melter weapons flying around at the moment. I'd say out of those units, it is good on any of them, maybe the most meaningful on the Skitarii troops if they're getting that for free. They only have a 4+ save anyway, so are a bit more likely to get pushed down to that invul and actually have it made meaningful. It's definitely not bad on the Kataphrons or the vehicles though. They're a bit more likely to be hit by very high AP attacks like Melter Fire, so getting at least a chance to shrug off that damage is pretty nice, and overall this makes the army as a whole just a bit more durable. I guess in theory it might mean that stacking saves a bit with things like the Lucius Doctrine and Bulwark and stuff, it might be a little bit less important, as at least you'll be guaranteed a basic save anyway. Moving on, there's plenty of other changes in Arks of Omen which will impact the Adeptus Mechanicus as well, maybe some more than others. I feel like Armour of Contempt being entirely gone is pretty good for the Codex. It means that quite a lot of the efficient choices in the Admech book that are AP-1 can shine again. In particular, the ones that first stand out to me might be things like the Rangers and Vanguard. Rangers with the AP-1 guns will be pretty universally effective now, no longer being ruined by Terminator armor, and Vanguard with a Manipulus buff with all their auto wounds with that stratagem, they're going to be a terror against the vast majority of things in the game. It'll also be helpful for the Iron Strider autocannons as well, they'll be a lot more effective against Space Marines. The Arks of Omen detachment is maybe a little bit better for Admech as well. Previously, Admech never really wanted to build out more than a battalion, as they want to spend loads of CP pre-game, so having access to a few more slots will help them out there. They can take more HQs if they wanted, without having to compromise on CP, and out of the options I feel like maybe the fast attack might be an interesting enough one to build around, maybe getting a few Cerberus Raiders to go up into the midfield, and then loading up on the very good Iron Striders and now much cheaper Dragoons. With the base detachment having at least 9 troops though, it means that you could really go hard on quite a lot of Kataphrons and Skitarii units. If you want to take them in a much more multiple small unit approach, that's now far more doable. Otherwise, beyond that, there's a fair few other minor changes. Free strategic reserves could be handy enough to hide things off the table for a bit of a beta strike. Maybe things like the Kataphron destroyers would be quite good for getting line of sight there, or even just delivering some scary blocks of Skitarii troops. That's certainly one way to make sure that your Vanguard get in range, I guess. Otherwise, Flyers got even worse having to start off the board. They didn't even get any points cuts as well, so I can't see them being taken anytime soon. The Fuselage in particular lost out, as it won't even be bombing things until turn 3. Allied Freeblade Knights is a bit of a handy change for the Admech. It's a bit of a flavour win, I think, seeing as previously you really didn't want to take them along to ruin your command points. If you want to have a big Allied Knight along, or a few Armigers, then now it's a lot easier, and I feel that's quite a big flavour win for the Admech who work with them quite closely in the lore. Finally, they have lost a couple of competitive options. The Skitarii veteran cohort is now no longer a thing, and while there are a lot of buffs going around, this one will hurt them just a bit. With their rules in Nephilim, it was perhaps the most common competitive army build for them, giving them some very nice options for manipulating their doctrine or imperatives, and had some powerful buffing options for Rust Stalkers. As per Games Workshop's legal supplements document, that's no longer legal, nor is the Metallica supplement also from Warzone Charadon. That was the main reason to play Metallica in my opinion, with the options to do silly things like turn off re-rolls and make enemy toughness worse. In general, I feel like Metallica is now no longer going to be one of the Forge Worlds to consider with competitive builds. Probably things like Mars and Lucius are going to come to the fore. Perhaps the biggest and most impactful changes, though, maybe come to all the points changes they got. Games Workshop went in with this with a fairly heavy hand, a fair amount of free war gear, and a lot of key units going down around about 10% or so in points costs. Rangers and Vanguard were already perhaps one of the most competitive units in the whole codex. They do remain 9 points, but they did get that very nice Bionics upgrade for free, so a 5+ invul there. They'll also be better because the AP-1 things don't care about Armour of Contempt anymore, and they've got a bunch of free or discounted war gear, the Sergeant melee weapons you get for free now, a bunch of upgrades at only 5 points, including the Arc Rifle, Plasma Caliber, Data Tether and Omnispecs. I feel like the Data Tether and Omnispecs will probably go back to being auto-includes in every big unit again, as opposed to being a bit more take or leave at 10 points. It's also 10 points for the Arquebus. I guess out of the weapon upgrades, it'll probably be Plasma or Arc Rifle to go for, as opposed to Arquebus Silver. The only other change for the troops was the Kataphron Destroyers. They remained the same points cost base, but they gained core in the 5+ invul. The Cognis Flamer and the Plasma Culverin both got 5-point discounts. I feel like they may be a little bit more internally balanced than they were. Previously, I think I would have usually wanted the Grouse with the Phosphor Blasters, so the options that I would have wanted a little bit less got a boost. Elsewhere in the Codex, there were fairly decent buffs for HQs across the board. Cole's 160, -20, the Marshall's down to 50 points, -5, the Dominus is down to 70, -5 again, and they get their free guns. The Manipulus got the biggest boost, going down to 70 again, so -10 there, and you can take the Transonic Cannon for free now, and the Engineer and the Techno-Archaeologist are both down to 50. Overall, the Manipulus seems to have won out the best out of this for a percentage-wise. I'd guess that they're probably still going to be one of the most commonly played ones, alongside the big blocks of the Rangers and the Vanguard, which are now more relevant with Armour of Contempt going. Otherwise, I'm still sure that loads of people will use the Marshal with the relic that allows him to have reroll 1s to hit and wound for Skitarii. Very efficient buffing character there, though I feel like the Dominus might be a little bit more relevant too, due to being able to affect Kataphrons, and perhaps the Engine Seer as well, with the heavier support going down. Basically a good time for the Skitarii HQs. I feel like even though Caller's dropped, he's probably not going to be any more massively relevant though. For other sections of the Codex, in the Elite slot, there's some drops for the Electro Priests, Infiltrators, and Rust Stalkers. All of them went down 2 points. I feel like the biggest winners might actually be the Electro Priests out of that. Previously, they felt really quite overshadowed by their Rust Stalker rivals. Now, with the loss of the veteran cohort and getting a bit of a bigger percentage points buff, I feel like both flavours of Electro Priest could be pretty interesting. I do quite like the idea of Fulgurites jumping out of the new, cheaper Dune Rider as well. You could have a unit of 10 of them in a Dune Rider for just over 200 points now, which is really quite a monumentally threatening unit for that cost. Infiltrators and Rust Stalkers still seem solid though. In the fast attack slot, the Sky Stalkers went down to 16 points, a -1 drop, which I don't think is going to be enough worth it to actually make them that relevant. I feel like they probably needed to drop more than that really. Cerberus Raiders I still think are decent enough at 18 points, a Data Teller's only 5 points now, so I guess they got a little bit more attractive. The Sulphur Hounds are 18 points, so they went down 2, a solid enough points cut there for a unit that I think was just a little bit underwhelming. These things do put out a fair amount of AP-2 anti-infantry fire. I feel like a few people are going to be having a play with them. And out of the entire codex, perhaps bar the Kataphrons, the biggest winners out of the whole update I think might be the Sindonian Dragoons. Their Taser Lance loadout dropped from 70 points down to 55, a pretty whopping 22% decrease, the best out of any of the points changes. And I feel like these guys had some pretty threatening melee already, to be honest. They're really quite fast, pretty hard to kill due to the innate -1 to hit that they have. I've gained a 5+ invul now, and overall I feel like a couple of threatening units of those for like 150 points each seems pretty reasonable. They're going to soak a lot of fire if the enemy wants to gun them down, and they'll be threatening against most things in the game if they get to make a charge. Finally, we've got the heavy support and transport changes. Another unit that's won fairly big in the heavy support section are the Castellan robots. If you wanted the range loadout for them, then the triple phosphor blaster loadout has dropped down to 85 points from 100. A solid efficiency increase, though they weren't a desperately good unit before, I thought. The Datasmiths also dropped down to 35 as well, a little bit more tempting to allow them a bit more flexibility. Otherwise, it is pretty good news for the other non-core vehicles in the heavy support. Honored Dune Crawlers are down to 100, regardless of whether or not you take the neutron laser. A solid 15 or 20 point drop, around 13%. In general, I feel like they do actually compete somewhat with the Iron Striders now, perhaps the raw firepower and durability being an overall slightly better deal. But admittedly, they don't have core, so if you are investing buffs in them, things like the Skitarii Marshal with the reroll 1s to hit and wound, I think it's still going to be a win for the Iron Striders overall. Definitely a lot more usable though, not bad for a low investment unit. It's kind of similar for the Scorpius tanks as well. They're now down to 125 points. I'd still be probably a bit more tempted by the Ferromite Cannon over the Energy Cannon at the moment. I feel like that one just pays maybe a bit too much, given the barrage nerf that made it -1 to hit and AP worse. Finally, I think the Scorpius Dune Rider is another really quite big winner, down to 85 points from 95. It was already pretty usable as a transport as they go, I think. I feel like having a whole bunch of Electro Priests jumping out of this for 200 odd points really is quite a cool idea. Fast enough to get them to the front, a whole bunch of heavy stubber shots, and you even have the potential to auto-explode it if it does die in an advantageous position. Overall, pretty great points cuts across the board for most things. I feel like they've perhaps done a bit better to make the internal balance of the codex just a little bit better now. Most of the biggest cuts fell to things that weren't getting a lot of play before. I'd say between the points and rules changes, perhaps the biggest winners are the Skitarii Troops and Manipulus, the Kataphron Servitors, Electro Priests and Dune Riders, Sindonian Dragoons, and perhaps the Dune Crawlers and the Scorpius tank. Next up, we've also got some Admech secondaries as well. These were all pretty terrible before, maybe being one of the best examples in Warzone Nephilim of how they weren't handed out too evenly between these guys and some of the top armies in the game. Literally all of them got a bit better, though they did lose that Uncharted sequencing one where you had to stand on different objectives on each turn. Accretion of knowledge is maybe still a bit specific, but in some games it's going to be very easy. You get 3 victory points per vehicle, relic bearer and warlord trait bearer that you kill in the enemy army. So basically kill vehicles and characters. You score them at the game end, and now the vehicles only have to have 8 wounds or more rather than a big 14. So I feel like in plenty of games this one is just going to be a flatly better upgrade on Bring It Down, particularly if the opponent's got a whole bunch of vehicles that are 9 or 11 wounds. Eradication of Flesh looks a bit more interesting, and perhaps one that you could build around. This one basically plays Admech vehicles versus the field. You need to kill more enemy units with your vehicles than you lose in vehicles yourself, and a fair few of the vehicles did get a bit more threatening in this update. You now score 4 victory points rather than 3 for each turn that you do it, as previously I think you were pretty guaranteed not to score too high. I feel like you could probably build for this just taking a couple of really big units of, say, Iron Strider Ballistari, make sure they kill a unit a turn, and in general that's going to be a hard secondary to prevent. Still a bit weird in that it can actually incentivize you not to take vehicles that are kind of medium like those Onagers or Scorpius Dune Riders, but I guess you could build for this one and have it be reliably successful now if you did just want to spam the Iron Striders. Finally, the hidden Archaeovault one is just massively better. It still means that your opponent has to select one objective in the midfield, and then you have to try and take it, which ordinarily isn't going to be the best thing in the world, but now at least it's a bit more doable. You get to score the objective at the end of your turn, not the battle round, meaning that it's not horrendously dependent on who goes first or second, and the reward for scoring it is 5 victory points now rather than 4, so you just need to grab it 3 times over the game. I still feel like this one could be a bit of a risk depending on the army that you're playing against. If they've got a massive force that's just going to be able to guarantee that they're holding one of those midfield objectives all game long, this one's still probably going to give you a rough time. I guess it depends which army is going to be the one that's going to bully the enemy off the midfield more effectively, so still a bit matchup dependent I think. I think you'd also not want to use it in missions where your opponent's got some objectives that are far easier for them to get to compared with you. In general though, decent improvements to all of them. I'd say maybe Eradication of Flesh might be the most reliable one to try and build around, though maybe does require you to set up your army in a specific way. Accretion of Knowledge will be absolutely amazing in certain games and useless in others, and Hidden Archaeovaults might depend on the mission and the matchup that you're playing. Generally, overall, I would rate the Admech as having done very well out of this. They were one of the weakest factions in the game, and I feel like Games Workshop has properly addressed this and given them some pretty monumental buffs to try and get them in contention again. The points cuts are pretty enormous, around about a 10% drop to a whole load of relevant units in the Codex. The 5+ Invul save will help out on some of their most competitive units with the Iron Striders and the Rangers. Core Kataphrons make them far more relevant again. I feel like we'll see a fair few more in list than we did before compared with the Skitarii troops, and the secondaries being improved I think will add to their tournament scores. I'd say perhaps the biggest negative from the update is the loss of the Skitarii veteran cohort, but overall I think that this all adds up to a big power boost. I'm kind of interested to see where Admech players take all these new toys. Certainly it seems like a lot of the big points winners are going to see table time a lot more Kataphrons, more Dragoons, potentially people building around Iron Striders even more, maybe more with auto cannons due to Armour of Contempt going, and potentially in enormous units to make that Eradication of the Flesh secondary a lot easier and deny enemy vehicle kills. The heavy supports and Electro Priest and Dune Riders also seem great, and the Manipulus seems perhaps even more relevant for HQs, as does perhaps the Engine Seer maybe buffing a heavy support or two. It'll be interesting to see how strong Admech emerges out of all this, whether or not they'll regain their title as one of the game's top factions, or this will just make them a bit more, say, upper mid-tier, but I feel like they're almost certainly out of the running for weaker armies in 40k right now. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments then. How would you be thinking to improve an Admech force after all of these changes, and what are the things that are the most important for the faction in your eyes? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll hopefully be making a fair few videos like this for the other factions that saw improvements and things. I've already done plenty more like Space Marines, Custodians, Orcs and Necrons, so feel free to search those out if you'd like, and I'll leave a link to my big winners and losers video from Arks of Omen down in the video description. Finally, if you've been getting some good value out of the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that in the video description also. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each and every month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.